Okay, we're live. And we're here with Alexandra Beaumont to celebrate the re-release of Testament of the Stars, which came out on the 1st. And I was excited to put it under Bridget's Gate. I'm Heather. This is Steve. We're the co-owners of Bridget's Gate Press. And Alexandra, why don't you tell us what you've got cooking besides this one?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. And lovely to be here. So I write mostly folklore fantasy. And so that tends to sort of bridge the gap between folklore and sort of superstition and that sort of tradition, and then sort of meshing that into fantasy as much as I possibly can. So a lot of my writing is sort of along those lines. So Testament of the Stars, which I'm sure we're going to come back and talk about, the sort of fantasy folklore mashup of that, is sort of very much in that vein. But alongside that, what I'm also doing is sort of writing short stories that also sort of explore some of that, and some of those are published on my website, and also sort of delving into a little bit of an idea where I might actually write something that's more towards sci-fi at some point, but I'm still cooking up to that idea right now. So
interesting.
Yeah. Bit of a range, but generally with a big love for folklore and fantasy, which is in everything I do.
Yeah, and I think your love for it shows in the stories for sure. So we always kick it off by, I tell the story about how my mother read to my sister and I every night as we were growing up, and we read everything. My parents didn't believe in book censorship, so we started very young on the actual real Grimm's fairy tales, which left us a little lost when we saw the Disney versions of some of them. But I like them both. But because of that, often when I start to fall in love with a story, my mother's voice becomes the narrator in my head. And that's still very true. And so I'm going to read the part of the book where my narrator voice turned into my mother's. The Starblood. Okay, hold on.
Take a breath.
Yeah. So I'm dyslexic, and I've chosen a sentence with a lot of troubled words for me. So I'm going to skip that one. What would happen when she drank it? Behind the stone bowl, two pitted fallen stars, they called the Star Rocks, dominated the chamber and grinned down at her in the flickering torchlight. Was this really everything her 10-year struggle had led to? The freedoms of rank were all that she had wanted, to marry and live as she chose. But at what cost? And I think it was that, and this is the Starblood drinking scene, which we've been talking about on social media quite a bit, because it really struck me when I first read it. I was like, okay, Starblood, let's do that. And but the writing is so vivid. Like, I feel the story immediately sucks you in because it starts in that kind of high fantasy. There's clearly a division, there's the astrologers, and then and it's got everything I love. It's got the cult, it's got astrology, it's got high political angst. And so, but I loved this idea of drinking the stars' blood so you could hear their thoughts. And almost like steal their thoughts. And I really like this scene in the cave, like their initiation scene, because, I think like all initiations of any kind, I can't really speak for cults since I've never been a member of one. But
I don't recommend it.
Any kind of initiation, you kind of have that, like, where they've gone over what's going to happen, but then it happens and you're like, is this how it's supposed to happen? Is this how everyone feels? Or is something wrong? Have I done it wrong? And I kind of love her voice gets established immediately. Is it Inya?
Anya.
I just make up how things are pronounced in my own head. Sadly, even just words I know, I make up how they're pronounced in my own head.
We love that.
Yeah. But like her voice gets established so fast in the chapter, and I like when she stumbles out, she's like, it's kind of a letdown, to have to be carried out, after this big super initiation that's supposed to be magical, and she's like, yeah. So I like how it kind of establishes she's not really a believer. She's just doing it because this is her means to an end, in this part of the book, and how quickly it kind of falls apart. And the thing about fantasy is it's hard to talk about it without having spoilers. But I'm going to try very hard not to. But so talk about what inspired you to write this story of I'm going to call it the Star Cult, because that's what I've been referring to it here at home.
That's entirely. Yeah. I mean, I think so. One of the things that I really wanted to do with this is sort of some of that high political drama that you were talking about. And what I wanted to do, which I don't think you see enough in fantasy really, was have a slightly mature female protagonist. Because quite a lot of the time what I think you see is someone who's just become an adult or is perhaps on the cusp of becoming an adult. And what I wanted to actually do was have a sort of fantasy protagonist who had actually gone through life and a bit more and had some ambitions and things that she wanted to achieve, such as, and I mean, this comes out in the first sort of few pages, so it's not too much of a spoiler, but she's trying to seek this marriage with her long-term sort of partner and things like that. And there's a whole load of politics as to the divide of the Star Cult lovers and the Star Cult haters and things like that, which make it very complicated. But I think it almost felt like if you built up all of that expectation of this sort of 10 years of trying to become part of the Star Cult, and that had been like someone's almost lifelong ambition to get there and things like that, and then suddenly it all falls apart, that felt way more powerful to me than anything that you do with someone who's just sort of fallen into a path as they've become an adult, because it's something that she's really strived towards. So I wanted to sort of really build that pressure of how much that was going to mean to Anya at that point. And then, as you say, obviously, it wouldn't be a book without it all falling apart in some fashion.
Right.
So actually, it sort of felt more momentous that it then shattered because you had that news.
And I think it's so important, because I do think that there is something very true about, and now maybe it's just the fantasy I read, because I will admit I can be a picky fantasy reader, but it seems like a lot of fantasy revolves around that kind of coming of age character. And so in whatever age that is in the fantasy world, whether it's, a younger teenager or early 20s or late teens, but it's kind of that young adult. I always call it the under 25 crowd. And so it's the under 25 crowd. And so I think one of the things that I really loved about this, and I think one of the things that's harder to find, is a character who's over 30. When your MC is over 30 and is more fundamentally entrenched in who they think they are. And, because I'm 50. And so sometimes I read these books and I was like, my God, I remember the angst of 17, but I am also glad that I do not ever have to do that again. That's a lot of angst. And that it's not that you don't change and grow after your teen years, but it's a different kind of growth, because you've got you've been alive longer, you have more experience. So it's not just, there isn't a lot of, oh gosh, you know what I mean? You're more established into, well, listen, we're going to have to do this. So you're going to have to get up. You can't just hide in a closet and cry with cookies. You've got a real life, you've got a real job, you've got to get yourself together.
Which she still does.
I haven't hidden the cookies in the closet since the kids were little. And that was just to eat them alone. Yeah.
I'll definitely still take hiding in the closet and eating the cookies on some days. But absolutely. I mean, it feels like sort of almost it's a harder hill to climb for a slightly more established character, doesn't it? You've already got all of that baggage and all of those problems and things like that. And it's kind of less like you're coming to the world fresh-faced, so it doesn't matter so much what happened. And
right. And when you reach a certain age and you've gone through so many steps, you kind of get to the place where you're like, okay, I've got this figured out now. And then the rug kind of gets rubbed out underneath you, and you're like, oh, I in fact don't have this figured out. And it's funny. Last year, my father and I were having a conversation, and he's 70. And I said, I really thought by 50, I would feel more entrenched in having it figured out. And he said, I've got bad news for you.
There's new things to figure out.
Yeah. And he's like, because I'm 70 and I feel like I'm just on the cusp of don't have this figured out again. And so, and I think as we get older, I think there's a little more angst in that. Oh, good. Tarzan, our cat, is here to join us. He thinks all of these are really about him. So, hi. When the pandemic started and everything was on Zoom, he was like, I'm here for it. Let's have this meeting. Let's do this thing. So he hasn't really grown out of it. But
what a beauty.
Yeah, he's something. But sadly, it'll take him a while to get settled. Come on.
Yeah. He's certainly got the climbing for his namesake.
Yes. Yeah. He used to swing from curtains to get momentum to move from one side of the room to the other, which is how he got his name.
Yeah.
And he's a Yowler because he's part Siamese.
But yeah, building on what she was saying, I think, every decade, every period of life, there's new challenges to figure out. I mean, and you're always on the edge of, oh, how do I handle this? What do I do here?
Yeah.
So,
and it feels more torn up because you're like, well, I've just invested 10 years into this. It's like when you're going to leave a job where you're like, no, I've put in 10 years here and now I'm going to start all over at a new company, and I may be walking into a higher position, but I've got to relearn how everything works,
right.
So there's a lot of that kind of angst that has a different weight than the coming of age angst, because when it's your life, it's the equal amount of what you have to lose. But when you're older, it's losing the stability that you've become used to, And so it's a whole different set of angst.
Right.
And maybe it's just because I'm entering what my husband lovingly calls the crone stage of my life, that I'm starting to be more interested in the stories where the main characters are older. But yeah. And but talk about, like, what was there a specific piece of history or specific folklore that was the inspiration for this story? Or did you find yourself kind of writing the story first and then thinking about a piece of folklore history? Like, what was your chicken or egg?
So yeah, the folklore definitely came first. So it's a sort of very specific historic bit of folklore, really. So I'm a big fan of like the Tudor and the Elizabethan era, and so there's quite a lot of odd beliefs during that time, as sort of people really sort of updated their thinking a little bit, and but that sort of took them in slightly strange ways at points and things like that. So one of the things that is quite a momentous sort of belief system, I guess, in the Elizabethan era particularly, was in astrology. So Queen Elizabeth, she had a court astrologer called Dr. John Dee, and
yes.
He's a really interesting character because people often believed in that time that there was sort of birth stars and things like that sort of set the path of your life. And it was almost like a sort of, felt to me when I was researching it anyway, like a sort of quasi-religious system, like so much stock was put in where the stars sort of foretold things were going to go. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people had, sort of royals would have fortunes told about like particular battles and how they were going to go and things like that. Mm-hmm. And so what I wanted to do really was take that and imagine if it was actually the religious system rather than obviously like the real world religious systems that they followed.
Right.
And that sort of took me right down a rabbit hole of, well, what would it look like? Obviously, you would have a sort of religious council and things like that were sort of the voice of the stars and then told the masses what the stars are saying and things like that, and what happens if you actually bring a star into the mix and things like that, and how do you get to hear the thoughts of the stars, which is how I came up with the star blood idea and things like that. So yeah, I just wanted to make it feel like this very sort of controlled sort of religious state to do with all of these stars, and how different nations also had different relations with the stars and that sort of thing. And that just felt like there was so much scope there that I had to write a story based on it.
That's really exciting to find out, because I'm a huge fan of John Dee. And I majored in history in college.
Oh, cool.
And my favorite period was the medieval period and the rise of the Tudor period, especially in England. And so I was a huge fan. I was a huge fan of, it's hard to make eye contact. I know I'm not looking anyone in the eye, but it's still, but I'm a huge fan of John Dee, how he was constantly, like, he was one of the few astrologers who would predict the death of someone.
Yeah.
And, you know, it was so taboo to predict the death of a monarch or the death of a duke, or, you know, it could be considered treasonous if you even had any kind of prophecy that was a little too deathy, you know, a little too, this will take you down the wrong path or you'll end up beheaded like your mother. And John Dee just didn't care. Like, he was like, yeah, well, I'll die when it's my time. Like, these things aren't dictated by me. They're dictated by the fates. And I'm a huge fan of John Dee. So I'm really excited to learn that the whole idea for the star cult is based on John Dee's astrology. So he's so interesting. You know, he invented his own language of the angels. And it's so, I don't know. It's just, he's just such an interesting figure. And I really, so much is researched around the Tudor period. You know, like, we could talk about Anne Boleyn or the clothing of the queens forever and ever. And I'm always so surprised by how little research there is into John Dee's life in comparison. And I know that the period's overshadowed with greats like Shakespeare and Marlowe. And so, you know, maybe it's not as attractive. But I thought he was just fascinating as a person.
Yeah.
And I thought it was so fascinating how not only Queen Elizabeth, but so many in the nobility, including a bishop, relied on his star charts.
A bishop too.
Yeah, a bishop. And so, yeah, I think it was the Bishop of Durham. I'd have to go back and look now. Now I kind of wish that Professor Dix was still alive and I could just call him. But yeah, but it's, I don't know, it's so interesting because everybody thinks of, especially the Elizabethan period, of the high Protestant period, and the eventual anti-Catholicism policies. And I think, yeah, I mean, listen, sure, don't get me wrong, all of those things were happening as she read her star chart, or her star chart was read to her. That's the part that always fascinates me. And I think part of that is because, as an American, when we think of Protestantism back in the 1600s, we think of, who are the lunatics in Salem again? The Puritans.
Right. Lunatics
in Salem. This will be really exciting if all of my history friends watch this. I'll get a lot of DMs later. But we think of the Puritans not necessarily like the Church of England, you know. Because I will tell you,
the Protestantism in England was more political rather than religious. So
well, I don't know that I get it.
Power.
I don't know that I'm going to agree with that outright. I think that's the case for some of the people, but I think for some of the people, it really was about a religious theological difference. You want to talk about this instead of Testament of the Stars, Alexandra? No. I could talk about this all day long.
I think this is a really good example about sort of the kind of atmosphere that I really wanted to bring into Testament of the Stars, right, was this kind
Yes.
of like religious conflict and these ideas, but in a slightly different
Right.
setting. And I mean, I think there was a thing as well that I became quite aware that I was writing this story almost like as I went through it, which sort of taps into all of this, which I realized I was telling a story of like, how much would you sacrifice to get what you wanted?
Right.
And
right.
I think that was like a key message in this, which to me felt ultimately, I think, like a really cathartic way of writing something parallel to the real world and sort of commenting on a bit of the real world without it being actually in the real world. But I mean, that question of like, what would you do to achieve this thing, this goal you have? And I think that very much taps into that sort of Puritanism and all of that religious sort of conflict of that time, right?
Angst, yeah. I mean, because it was a period of really big religious change, because you're also talking about a period in time. I mean, after Elizabeth died, James becomes king of England and Scotland, and he's terrified of witches. I mean, more than any other monarch England ever had, and which I think is saying something.
Yeah.
But so you kind of have the rise. No, you kind of have. I don't know if Henry VIII was really afraid of anything, but I do think that he used witchcraft as an excuse to get rid of people he didn't want. Yeah. But James really believed they were witches. Yet, I mean, without question. And so it's kind of this interesting vergence of historical period, which I think shows through in the book, is this kind of idea of it's really a quagmire of different belief systems kind of trying to nest in the same bowl together, because you definitely had Catholicism still trying to cling to its power in, you know, what's now considered the United Kingdom, and then Protestantism trying to break through, but in several different sects, you know, between Calvinism, the Church of England, and John Knox trying to rule Scotland, right? John Knox, it was John Knox, right? And who hated Mary Stuart. But I think that, you know, and then the king declaring himself the head of the church. I think it's a very, I mean, really, he just can't get settled. He wants to be a part of it, but we moved his bed. He's so obnoxious. I have a cat bed on my desk, so he'll sleep next to my keyboard, but we move his bed during the lives and it irritates him. So we may have to reintroduce the bed into the lives, and we'll just have, I mean, we've got shoes in the background. Who cares if we have a cat bed?
Good publicity, I think. Cats make everything better.
Right. It becomes a cat video. But you know, it's interesting because I hadn't really thought about my love of fantasy and the connection between, because my favorite periods in history to study are always the ones where there's big change, whether it's religious revolution or a change in a family line or big change brought on by years of the plague and way too many people dying. And the kind of, because my favorite fantasy is the kind of political fantasy, I guess, for lack of a better word. So yeah, but it's so, that's really interesting. Now that we've talked about that, I can see I've got a lot more clicking in my head about the story, and I have to go back and reread it, because now there's a particular section I have to find and reread now, thinking about.
Well, maybe you all will have to sit down and have a couple hours discussion.
Right. We'll have to follow up. We'll have a follow up.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think also the bit you were saying, Heather, earlier, that before we got on this call, that you really liked, which was those sort of introductory statements at the beginning of each chapter, that I think was very much sort of me trying to write sort of what felt like religious doctrines of the time, but in a star setting. So you might enjoy those again now with this. Like,
with a little more. And I love that. Like, I just saw that in another book that I read, I don't know, in the last 3 months. And I was so enchanted with it. And I didn't realize that that was a thing that I really, really liked in fantasy, but I kind of like the establishment of either it's, you know, religious and doctrinal bits, or in this other book, I think it was letters, like quotes from letters back and forth. And, but I just think it's such a clever way to provide more, is atmosphere the word I'm looking for? Yeah. You know what I mean? But to provide a, it's kind of like a sneaky peek into the world building, and without having to do a lot of, show in a chapter. You can just, it's easily done with 1 to 4 sentences, and then boom. And it's not only kind of set the scene for the chapter, but it's given you more depth into the world building. And I'm just going to tell you, I think it's clever as hell. I mean, it's just a great way to get more oomph into the story. And so I love it. I'm now going to look for that, I think, when we go to actual bookstores. There's going to be the things I look for.
I think one of the things, I think one of the things that I found really helpful about it as well, from a writing technique perspective, was that world building thing you mentioned. It's really made me think about things and sort of made me build the world. It sort of helped me flesh out things and think about sort of, if there was a religious document at the time, what would it say? What would people say in their version of Parliament and things like that? So
and what would be your interpretation? I think it's so interesting, and I think that it's one of those things, because in fantasy you do want world building. It's one of the things I think that attract fantasy readers is world building, and I think it's a clever key to make sure the world building is still happening in the reader. But I think it also, as a reader, I look at it and I think, is anybody alive now interested in this interpretation of the astrologer elect's? You know what I mean? How he saw this, how many people believe this is doctrine or question this is doctrine. And so it kind of provides more curiosity, I think, too, for the reader, things to wonder about. So I would say that, hold on, I had a thought and it's gone.
While you're thinking.
You're going to say something? Okay.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you, Alex, what are some of the books or stories you read growing up that inspired you in your own writing, or to become a writer?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so one of my favorite books of all time is actually, it's not strictly fantasy, but it has definite speculative elements to it. And this is The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's a Spanish book which was translated into English. And basically it's set during the Spanish Civil War in Barcelona, in this really sort of opulently gothically described city, where there's basically this mystery about this author who wrote this one amazing book, The Shadow of the Wind, which was so famous that then basically the author couldn't cope with the pressure of it and then sort of disappeared and nobody knew where he went. And there's sort of almost this fantastical element to it, which is layered with the sort of gothic mystery that the author sort of infuses into it. And that for me was just such a beautiful story, a sort of mashup of something that felt fantastical with something that was inherently historical, and with this kind of constant wondering of what actually happens and things like that, whilst being very beautifully described. And that was a sort of big inspiration for me, because I think reading a lot, obviously having read a lot, sometimes you see things that are quite plaintively described. Sometimes you see things that just do one type of story. And this just had everything of mystery and beautiful description and sort of odd elements, the sort of feeling of the uncanny. So that's one of my absolute favorites from a non-fantasy perspective. From a fantasy perspective, I mean, it's a bit cliche to say, but Lord of the Rings has had big influence, as I'm sure.
Right.
Every fantasy
it's true,
novel has. Yeah, for sure.
It's true. I mean, you can't escape it.
No. Yeah. And I think, I mean, just the world building, you kind of have to just enjoy that and accept that, it's cliched, but we're all going to say it, right?
Right. We're all going to say it because it's true. It doesn't matter if it's cliche or not.
Yeah, for sure. I'm just looking over my bookshelf now to sort of try and pick out some of my other favorites. I mean, one of my favorites that have read sort of a few times is the sort of first 4 books of Erikson's Malazan Book of the Fallen series, which is, again, is sort of one that all fantasy authors say, oh yeah, Malazan. But I think what I really liked about that is the sort of different characters and how they all had their sort of interplays and things like that. And as the story builds, that sort of richness of the character connection really becomes important. And that's something that I sort of try and do in my writing now as well, is sort of make every character sort of breathe and be real, however minor they are. And that's something that I think sometimes doesn't happen in all fantasy books, right? Sometimes you go, oh, that's a plot character.
But that character was to move chapter 3 from A to B, so done. But yeah, I think that hold on, this was the question I was going to ask. When you were writing this story in particular, did you have, what do they call it, plotters versus pantsers?
Yeah.
Did you start with like an outline, and did you start with the quotes at the beginning of the chapter, or did you go back in and write those in, or was it a little of both?
It was a little of both. I started, so I'm definitely a plotter, because I'm the kind of geek that loves a table and a plan. But yeah, I started, so I started, as I usually do, with, I wrote like the sort of first chapter type thing, and sort of tried to sort of find the world and the voice that I wanted to use and that sort of thing. And then once I'd kind of gone, right, I think that actually does work, then I planned every chapter out. And I think about sort of maybe 5 chapters into doing that planning, I was like, oh, right, okay, now I want to do these like introductory snippets and things like that. And that just helped me pace the rest of the book when I did that, because then it sort of tied into each plot point and things like that. So yeah, definitely a planner.
Planner, good. I like it. So I'm wondering, do you have a piece or a part of the book that you'd like to read today for the re-release launch?
Yeah, sure. I was thinking I'd probably just do the opening.
Sure.
Largely because I think, as you said, it sort of just brings that whole atmosphere together in a way that sort of other bits of the book, it's kind of, you need that, I think, to get into the rest of it, probably.
Sounds good.
So yeah, this is from chapter 1. And do you want the little snippet at the beginning or no?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Absolutely, yes. So the snippet at the beginning is, the astrologer-elect oversees the astrologers, seconded only by the council and the guard. All will answer to the stars, the first astrologer-elect. And I'm just going to drink some water, because otherwise I know I'm going to get halfway through page 1 and regret it.
Speaking of it.
A good reminder all around, right?
That's right.
Chapter 1. Time crept by for Anya Arden. Locked in the astrologer's cave for 30 days in preparation for this moment, left blindfolded so that she would learn to feel the fallen stars without seeing them. They were so close. They felt like her own shadow, but she still didn't feel ready to join the settlement star-worshipping cult. Initiates, your day has come. Astrologers enter. Anya flinched a little as the clear voice rang out, breaking the long silence. Sounds of shuffling leather shoes echoed through the cavern as the established astrologers sidled in. She twitched as bodies bustled by, knocking against her where she knelt. Soft hands brushed her cheeks before tugging away the blindfold. She couldn't make out the face of the person who'd done it, as cracks of sunshine splintered around the gap in the door that led into the cave, blurring her vision in the sudden light. Shadows of shapes slowly emerged, her vision settling. What now? Slowly she stumbled to her feet and tried to slow her breaths, watching the other initiates cluster together. Over there, a voice boomed behind her. Anya startled and turned to see a face of the astrologer looming in over her. His strong hands jostled her into a line with the other initiates, the press of their bodies surging around her. Too close, she clumsily stumbled over strangers' feet. A font etched with constellations and 2 carved faces dominated the middle of the astrologer's cavern. Each initiate ahead of her stepped up to it and lowered their head. What happened then, she couldn't tell in the darkness. Gulping nervously, Anya shuffled forward in the line until she stood before the font, gripping the stone handles. She looked up, the astrologer-elect standing ahead of her with an imperious glare across the cave. "Drink the star blood," he commanded. Anya's breath hitched and she looked down to avoid the man's gaze. The star blood undulated with translucent colours in the cauldron. What would happen when she drank it? Behind the stone bowl, 2 pitted fallen stars they called the Star Rocks dominated the chamber and grinned down at her in the flickering torchlight. Was this really everything her 10-year struggle had led to? The freedoms of rank were all that she had wanted. To marry and live as she chose. But at what cost? Now she stood between the stars that had fallen into Jemind 100 years ago, with disappointment tingling through her. Where were the magnificent glowing beacons of truth the astrologer-elect proselytized about? All she saw were dull grey rocks. The stone floor was slick with frost, her bare feet almost slipping as she took the final step up to the lip of the font. She looked up, longingly glancing at the door to the sunlit courtyard beyond. Eggshell whites of all the other astrologers' eyes reflected the low torchlight, hanging like glowing orbs in the darkness. The clipped voice of the astrologer-elect grated through the cavern again, his deep gouged wrinkles heavy set in a frown. "Initiate Arden, mix your blood and then imbibe the blood of the stars. Become one of us. Do not delay your ascension. There is no choice for you now." Anya dragged in a shuddering breath, bile rising in her throat. Her fingers fumbled with a clasp holding her dagger in place as she tugged it free from the frigid leather. She raked the knife across her palm, plunging her hand into the cauldron. The liquid seared her flesh as she scooped it up and raised it to her lips. The heated elixir reeked of eucalyptus and left a blue powder residue clinging to her acorn flesh. The star blood stung as it slid down her throat. Staggering away from the cauldron as the next initiate stepped up behind her, she slumped against one of the star rocks. The faces of the assembled crowd of astrologers blurred. Was this normal? A strange euphoria seeped into her mind. Manic laughter tumbled from her lips, and long nails dug claw-like into her wrists. A steady trickle of blood pattered to the ground from her hand. Someone clutched her shoulder, muttering some kind of welcome that didn't quite sound coherent. The star blood still burned through her veins. Lightheaded, she clumsily grabbed at the nearest astrologer to stop herself crashing to the floor. "This isn't what I wanted. I didn't know it would be like this," she mumbled, but her words sounded like screams in her ears.
I love it. I love it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Spoilers if we go too much further, right?
Yeah, it is. It does. It kind of, you get into spoilers really quick, but I love this scene where she's so, because I feel like, I mean, even if it's like, I mean, something as simple as high school graduation, you know, you practice it, your school makes you practice it, and then you do it and you're like, hold on. Did we practice? Are we going left or right? Do we walk in front of the stage or behind the stage? Like, there's always something. And I love that part of it because even though she's been doing this, you know, and she's been working for this, she gets to the event. She's like, hold on. Yeah. Is she supposed to feel this way?
It's always different when you
do it. And so I think that's one of the pieces I like. And I think one of the things about fantasy we always look for, maybe just me, is some kind of initiation, you know, to something, you know, either you've joined a certain group or you've graduated or whatever it is, like you've become part of this group. And it's a great way to open
a bigger world that you
were aware of. Yeah, it's a great way to open the book because I think it sets the whole scene for, I mean, as fantasy does, for something to go not as planned.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely love it. So I'm very excited to learn the link of John Dee. Like Steve knows it, and we are going to talk about this all day long now. So I am very excited. I don't know how excited Steve is, but I'm very excited.
I might text our son and let him know.
Come up at your own risk. Mom's on a history bender. But oh, that's very fun. Well, thank you for joining us, and thank you for letting us re-release the book. So it's out everywhere books are sold, and I think our library is going to pick it up. So
Nice.
hopefully we'll be on a bigger library circuit soon. So
That's exciting.
yeah.
Before we go, is there anything you would like to say to your readers, to your fans? I mean, especially since this is a re-release and not
Yeah.
the first time it's out.
I think I should probably do some cheesy thank yous.
Sure, absolutely.
So, I mean, first I'll say thanks to you both for picking it back up again, because I was really honoured
Our
that
pleasure.
you saw the potential in it to take it back again, and also were keen to do a shiny map, which I'll also.
I love that for the book.
It's really good to have one. It's just, yeah, it feels like one of those things that you're like, yeah, now I'm a proper fantasy author. There's a map in my book.
Right. Yes.
But yeah, so and also I'll credit Becky Appleyard, who's the artist who did the map, and that's excellent. And also, yeah, a big thanks to Elizabeth Leggett, who obviously made the beautiful cover art, which I so love. It's so good.
Yeah.
One other one that to nick the time a bit, can I do two more?
You bet you. You bet you.
Absolutely.
So one I'm definitely going to do is my husband, Paul, who I think is listening to this in the pub with my friends. He helped me edit this. He's a professional editor, so he did a lot of work for free. He's also, and Heather, I think you'd get on with him really well. He's also a history specialist about the medieval period and the Tudor start.
Excellent.
Nice.
Excellent.
I feel like you guys should talk.
Yeah.
But so that's one. And also my friend Rachel, who I think is in the pub with Paul, still listening to this. And she also did a great amount of sort of reading this and sort of assessing the characters and things like that. And she has been on at me to write the sequel. And so one thing that I didn't tell her when I was in the pub earlier is that I've actually started to plan the sequel now, because she keeps saying, don't write new things, stop writing new things, write the sequel to Testament of the Stars. So here you go. I've got a plan for it, and I've got a nominal working title, which is The Astral Tide. So
excellent.
That's my plan for that. And then, of course, we should probably mention Dissonance of Birdsong for next year as well, right?
Oh, yes. Coming out next. So very fun.
Yeah, which is still folklore, but set in the real world, but kind of like Cornwall folklore and birds. Still weird cults. That seems to be very much my thing, is weird cults, but yeah.
Weird cults. Gotta love it. I'm down for every weird cult.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, that's it. We're going to wrap it up then. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a lovely dinner. And we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, talk to you soon. Have a lovely day debating religion.
Oh, yes, absolutely. All right. Goodbye.
Take care. Bye.